In today's video, I am excited to share with you my guide for watercolor skies and clouds. It started as a video where I was just going to show you 3 different ways to paint skies with watercolor, including the clouds, and just kind of share some of my tips and tricks there. But I thought it would also be helpful to include some watercolor mixing just to create my go-to sky colors as well. And then I thought it really wasn't complete without diving into some of the anatomy and just the basic bare bones of creating a sky. Now, if you're really familiar with one-point perspective or with landscapes in general, some of this will be a review for you, but I think that you'll find that a little bit of review and a firm foundation in just understanding skies will really help you as you start to put paint to paper. So without further ado, let's dive into my full guide for painting skies with watercolor. In this first section, we are going to go over kind of the anatomy of a sky or clouds. And these rules of thumbs are just designed to kind of help you to plan out your landscape or your skyscape in order to equip you for success. Now, with all rules of thumb, there are some exceptions, but in general, these are things that will help you as you're painting, as you're approaching your painting, to not only have a little bit more realism, but general success overall. Now, this first tip is one that if you've done a landscape tutorial with me before, you've heard over and over again, and that is your sky, the value, should be darker at the top, and as it approaches the horizon line, or the place where the sky and the ground meet, it should get lighter. So you can see that this color here is darker than this color here. Same paint, but I diluted it as I was going down. This effect is called aerial perspective, and that's just really a fancy word that explains the way our atmosphere and our eyes work together. As things go back and are farther away from us, they're usually hazier, softer, less detail, because our eyes see less and there's just more atmosphere in the way. So this mountainous range, kind of hilly range, in the back of this photo is much lighter than the trees here. It doesn't mean that the same types of trees are not on this mountainous region. It just means that it's farther away. Now our eyes know that, our brains know that automatically, and mimicking the effect that we already see helps our viewer to understand what we're trying to communicate. This color change is also true if you're working with a sunset, so it's deeper and then it gets lighter. And if you're working with an entirely different color altogether, you can see that this mauve-y sky, which I'll show you how to mix this color in a little bit, is deeper at the top of the page, and as we approach the horizon line, we get a little bit softer. Which actually leads us to a second way to show that depth or that space in our landscape. By having the clouds show less contrast. So this cloud here is the same color as this cloud, but because the background around it is darker, there's more contrast here and you can see more detail. Right here, you just can't see as well. And so that automatically tells our eye that it's farther away. Another great tool that you can use for creating that depth is overlapping shapes. Whether it's a more obvious overlap or they're just kind of blending together, but there's obvious distance in between them, that helps your viewer's brain to know that there's space and distance there. Here's another example where there's a cloud here, but it's overlapping this cloud here, showing that there's some space there. That's an easy way to show depth and communicate with your viewer. Now, the last way that I want to chat about showing depth is actually size. So that is something that, as you know, somebody who's standing next to you is going to look much larger than somebody who is across the room or maybe down the street. So as we use size, we can see, okay, this one probably hits right about here on our landscape. So it's not directly over us or where we're standing, but it's pretty close. This one, on the other hand, is obviously farther away, and this one is even farther. We can tell that partially just because of the size. We've got this one shrinking down to this one, shrinking down to this one. Significant difference in size, also translating to our brain as a significant difference in distance. In addition to the size difference, this cloud, which is farther away, is getting closer to the horizon line. As things are getting farther away from us, they should slowly get closer to the horizon line. So that is true for both sides of the horizon line. Just as it's approaching the horizon line, the farther away it is. This kind of mountainous region sitting right on the horizon line, that's our farthest element, other than maybe that cloud that's right next to it. Lastly, I want to quickly talk about where shadows should go on a cloud, because it's a little counterintuitive. For us, we have our horizon line, And then this is where we are. Don't tell anybody I just made a stick figure. All right, and then we have our clouds. So I'm just going to represent them as a box because they are a three-dimensional shape to us most of the time. An exception would be like a wispier cloud where the light can often shine through it, and so there's not as many of these shadows. You're going to see more reflected light there rather than necessarily like shadows. Okay, so with a cloud, you might see some overlap. Let's just draw another one. This is more what you would see for like more of like a fluffy cloud that has a little bit more depth to it. You can see we have the shadows in here and they are consistent, which is definitely something you want to keep in mind. You want your shadows to be staying on the same side. The sun should be coming from a consistent direction. So not only should your foliage, should your landscape reflect that, so any shadows should be on the right-hand side because in the sky they're on the right-hand side. But you also want to think of shadows that the clouds themselves might be casting. So there's like a little bit of a shadow here with this overlap and right here. The most confusing thing is that often when we're painting, we place highlights on things. So we've got a highlight here in the sky where it's a little bit lighter, where the sun itself is shining on here and we've got like these shadows here. Clouds are a little bit different because they are above us and the sun is also above us. So oftentimes we see the shadowed section. If you were to see kind of these thicker, fluffier clouds and you were to look straight up at the one that's over you, you're mostly going to see shadow. Now you might see a shadow on one side or the other, but the highlights are going to reflect wherever the sun may be. And that can get a little bit tricky for some people. So you need to plan out where your highlights are going to be or where your sun is going to be before you get started. Now usually you can go, it's kind of on the right or it's kind of on the left. In this case, if we've got a shadow on the right and on the bottom, our sun is most likely somewhere up here. But let's say that you wanted to do a sunset like this. So again, we have these three-dimensional shapes. I'm going to draw on this side, so this is about to become a confusing piece of paper down here. So we've got our cloud shape, but because the sun is down here, as we can see here, it's going to illuminate across, and this will be highlighted. This might be kind of light, but this will now be in shadow. So not only will this be in shadow, obviously the top that we can't see is going to be in shadow. Where on this side, when we had the sun on our left, our shadows were over here and our highlighted section would be kind of on this side that we can't see. So it's one of those things, try not to overthink it too much, but have a plan. Now the last thing I'm going to dive into, which it does kind of jump into color a little bit, but I think it's important to mention here. If you are doing a sunset like this, it can be very tricky to capture the accurate colors, especially the color transitions. When it comes to like a blue sky, just a regular beautiful sunny day, turning into kind of this goldy, dusky evening. That's tricky because blue mixed with yellow creates green, or blue mixed with orange can create brown or gray. So that really becomes tricky when you're trying to create a clean transition. This is tricky because the way that light mixes is different than the way our pigments mix. Our pigments have a primary code of red, yellow, and blue, and this is what we work off of, and this is how we paint, and this is what we're probably most familiar with. Now, if you're working with light, you have a primary code with red, green, and blue. And I don't totally understand the way those colors mix, but they can mix differently than the way that our pigments mix. So they can mix in the sky nicely in a way that doesn't look weird, but a way that does look weird when we try to mimic it with paint. But I found a hack that I'm excited to share with you. It's so simple, and it's something that I started doing, and now like my sunsets seem to make sense, at least to me. I come down with the blue and then I have a blank space, like a white band, and then I bring the warm colors up and I allow them to kind of diffuse into this thin white section. Our brain is able to actually merge the separation of the two colors together. So even though they don't touch in here, we kind of create our own natural gradient. That will allow our viewer to see a beautiful gradient sunset without us having to have a green band in the middle. Let me show you another example real quick. So here is similar size, similar idea, where we have our dark blue sky coming down, it lightens up, and then there's no pigment in here. In fact, there are areas where my clouds kind of disappear because the highlighted section is the same color as the paper. But by bringing up this orange-yellow color and just barely touching that white band and allowing it to kind of fade out, allows me to create the illusion of that gradient while avoiding having any green band awkwardness within my sunset itself. So that's kind of my little bonus. It's something that I figured out kind of in this past year of just playing around with landscapes. I hope that all of those tips were helpful. And now that we understand the anatomy of our skyscape a little bit more, let's get into color mixing. So I have my full palette, and if you want to know more about the colors in here, I'll have a video where I kind of tour everything linked up here. Sorry about all the hand gestures. I guess I'm in one of those moods today. But I wanted to show you some of my favorite ways to mix a sky. Let's just start with something that's really classic, cerulean. Cerulean is kind of considered a staple if you're going to be working in landscapes. Just one of those beautiful natural sky tones. It is very bright. I rarely go in with just pure cerulean. I might for this tutorial just for fun. But it is a great one where you can desaturate it a little bit with whether it's a little bit of orange. So I'm going to use a little bit of burnt orange. You can grab a little bit of yellow or a little bit of red in here and just a little bit of desaturation. You want to be careful. If you go in with yellow, it could easily become greenish. And we quickly get kind of a nice, little bit more natural sky tone, where originally with cerulean was really quite bright, which again, if you're going for like a sunny beach scene, this is going to be your color. You'll want to kind of dilute it a little bit with some water, but it is a great option for that perfect sunny day. Next, let's talk about my ultimate go-to. This starts with either an ultramarine blue, or I like to use Indanthrone a lot, and then I like to pull a green in. Lately, my favorite to pull in is Perylene Green. So here it is on its own. It's a very dark, cool tone green. In fact, the pigment code has black in it, which means that that's a big part of it. So, but just a touch of that really brings some moodiness, but it's still a little too bright for me personally. Or just kind of grumpy. You can dilute it a little bit. That's a great option. I actually like to add just a little bit of red, and I'm going to add quinacridone red here. Just a touch of this, not a lot. See how quickly that became purpley? But just a touch of this adds like the perfect smoky gray that I just love. Now this is similar to like if you had a very desaturated indigo, maybe a Payne's gray. I've actually never used Payne's gray personally. I've heard from people who love it, but I love how, especially if you already have a green pole or if you already have a red, this can really kind of bring in some of those colors that are already going to be in your palette for your painting. See how that just adds, it's just a really nice stormy color. It adds a little bit more depth than this kind of more green one where when we just had the Perylene Green in there. But see how fun that is? I don't know. That's definitely a favorite. It's probably the formula, if you will, just kind of the blue with a little bit of green and a little bit of red. We have all of our primaries in there because the green is obviously blue and yellow, but I just find that that particular mixture adds into this smokiness, this moodiness. When I use this color, I feel like the sky has its own presence and just commands that with the color without necessarily overpowering the rest of the landscape because it's not very bright, but it is a color with a lot of depth and interest. All right, so in a way, I feel like I've kind of already given you 4 colors because we have our pure cerulean, our desaturated cerulean, we've got our blue and green mixture, and then we've got our blue, green, and red mixture. These are where I tend to camp out, but sometimes you want something a little bit more rosy. In fact, I was playing around with this the other day. Ultramarine blue, some red, and we're going to add a lot of red in here. But then we're going to desaturate it still more with just a little bit of yellow. And this is kind of my mauve-y, goldeny tone. I haven't done a lot of tutorials with this. Be careful with the yellow, especially. I'm using transparent yellow here. She's pigmented, so add her sparingly. This can be a fun way to have kind of that mauve-y, moody, sunset-y color where you've got some solid pink in there. And I know here it looks like horrifying, but I promise when it's on the paper, it's just so pretty. And I like how you can have, you know, like kind of a more purpley tone one, maybe at the top, and it's coming down slowly to the more mauve-y. And then it just fades nicely into more golden tones. So I just found that this one can be really fun and beautiful if you use it carefully. Now, obviously, if you're going to go with something like this, the sky is the star of your show, so you don't want to do a ton of extra detail or work on your landscape itself because the sky is where the focus is going to be with colors like this. I find that with these two, it can kind of go either way depending on what you want to do with your clouds, with where the hierarchy is, how the paper is divided. But this one, make sure that your focus is the sky because that's where we're all going to start looking anyway. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. I have a lot of videos where it's kind of a guide video like this, where there's a lot of tips on a certain topic, as well as full talk-through tutorials. My goal throughout my channel is to teach you the why behind the how, which basically means I'm not just going to show you how I created something and give you the step-by-step formula. I want to show you why I did this or that, why I'm mixing these colors together so that you're then able to turn around and apply that to your own artwork. And with that said, let's get back to the painting, shall we? Now let's make a quick landscape with each of these colors. Skyscape, clouds, you know what I mean. I have everything taped off. This is just a cold press watercolor paper. It's the Strathmore 300 series. You're going to need some tissue paper. I prefer to have, when working with skies like this, especially because we're going to be switching colors a lot here, 2 cups of water, because you can have one that can get dirty and one that's nice and clean. And I'm also going to use a larger brush like this. Now, this is not required, but because we're working on skies and it might be taking up a lot of space, it's nice to work quickly. So I will be using one of these. You're definitely able to do without it, but I find that this is really helpful. Let's start with just some super happy clouds. So we're going to go into our cerulean, and we're going to go real fluffy with these clouds. So you're going to need some bath tissue, and I just crumple it up. It's very unceremonious. I don't have a special way that I do it, but I will show you a trick with this in just a moment. So have that handy. I'm just going to set it off to the side there. I'm just going to wet our paper down. You can mist it. You don't have to do it this way. So we're going to start, and as we know, the sky is deeper at the top, and it's going to get lighter as it goes down. Now, if you have a large brush like this, you can use this to apply your pigment, and I would recommend that. But as you can see, this works just fine. And these stripes that are in here, those will dissipate. So I'm just kind of going back and forth. I don't want to rub the paper too much because that will cause its own problems. I am going to desaturate it just a touch at the very top just to deepen it a little bit more. Pull in some more pigment. Now, cerulean is granular, so if you see some separation, that's very normal. Granular just meaning that it's a grainy color. And so it might have a little bit of a speckly look at certain points, especially certain points when it's drying. Okay, now we're going to take our tissue that we wadded up, and we're going to dampen just a touch, just the very tip of it. Sometimes I dip it into water on my palette. It's not a lot, so it's just kind of this section is wet and this is all dry. And I'm going to use that to pick up excess pigment. And I just find that working with the wet really helps. Now, a lot of people will tell you not to use tissue. That's fine. If they don't like to use it, they don't have to. But I've just found it so helpful. That is just such a nice tool. And working with it wet gives you these nice fluffy edges here, where when you work with the dry edges, it tends to get a little bit crispy and irregular, which is not usually what I'm going for. So I'm just gonna kind of add some clouds in here. I'm actually even gonna take a little bit of our desaturated cerulean with that little bit of the burnt orange, and I can kind of add to some of the clouds and shadows in here, because we know that the shadows, if it's a bright sunny day, the sun is above the clouds, but the section that we see the most is going to be more in shadow. Being careful not to let this be too wet. You want it to be kind of a glaze where there's not a lot of water, not a lot of pigment. I'm going to dab that off. We're just kind of bringing this in here. If you have too much water, you'll get an awkward bloom as this thing dries. Which is not what we're going for. All right, so those are your fluffy clouds. Now let's talk about more of a wispy cloud. So we're gonna work now with our moody color to make some wispy clouds. Make sure that you mix enough paint to cover your entire sky. It would be better to have too much paint than not enough and have to mix in the middle, unless you're working with cerulean, and then it's not that big of a deal. All right, now for some very easy wispy clouds. I'm gonna start with this brush again, just because it's clean and it's available. And I'm going to just place back and forth shapes of water where I want the clouds to be. Now, if you look here, you can see that sheen and kind of the overall shape. I just kind of went back and forth here. I might extend it a little bit more off the page like this, but just think about when you see wispy clouds, whether it's on a road trip or just looking outside. It's just trying to get some shapes generally, kind of at a diagonal, I find is more interesting and a little bit more lifelike. And you're just gonna let that water sit there. Now, obviously we don't want the water to sit here for too long or it will dry. I'm actually adding a little bit more water onto it since I had to step away to show you. And then we're going to apply the sky, but we're gonna carefully place our pigment down. Let me get that round brush back. And then you'll just kind of touch where that wet section is. So it helps if you're kind of at an angle. So we're just kind of tapping into that. And once it touches, you kind of back off. So you don't want to get too active in here. And I do need to occasionally consciously dilute my brush and the pigment on there. I don't want this to be as dark as what we have up here. So I want to, we want to be careful to not lose what we already have learned just because we're learning something new. Oops, getting too dark down here. So, and as we're going down, this section is wider and this becomes more narrow because, again, these are farther away. So even though they would be similar, you would think, at least our brain would tell us that, you want it to have its own hierarchy to show importance and kind of distance. I might just kind of tap this in here. If I'm making any strokes, I want to make sure they're still with the clouds. But see, this one especially, that one's like ready to go. Looking really beautiful. I might just kind of check in here, especially because I worked with some pretty heavy water. You'd want more of like a sheen. And I'll pop that on the screen to avoid any blooms. Some are going to happen, but you don't want it to be too crazy. The biggest thing with this one is to not overwork it, like I have a tendency and seem to be doing right now, So we're going to step away from that, and that's just kind of your wispy watercolors. It's just a nice way to have a little bit of interest in your sky, but not let it take over your painting where that becomes the focus. The nice thing about this method is that it really allows your landscape later to be the focus. All right, let's make some moody, kind of shadowy clouds. They're going to have kind of a fluffy look again, but we're going to work with some of that moodiness, some of that shadow. Okay, this time we're going to go into that pinky sky, and we're just going to bring her down the same way we were doing before, where we're starting nice and bright. And we're just going to bring her down. Probably should have mixed more. Listen to my own advice. I have found that if you want moody clouds, err on the side of purple. Now you want it to be a very gray purple, and a little bit more of our yellow, and that will help to kind of gray it down. So you don't want it to be screaming at you. This is a shadow. Quieter down, there we go. And on paper it'll be a little bit more. See how smoky that is? And with this still damp is my preference, although sometimes it just doesn't happen. You don't want your brush to be too damp, so dab that off on a paper towel if you need to, and you're just gonna... Now we don't want it to be too damp because we don't want to create any blooms. So if you need a little bit of water, add the water so that you have some transfer of paint, but don't create a bloom with it. And these are just getting progressively a little bit smaller, a little bit closer together. I'm going to mix a little bit more and tap that in here. It might be a little bit more blue tone, and add that to the top, because if the sun is going down, now this top section that's kind of facing us is the shadow. And just kind of build up that intensity slowly with layers of very careful wet on wet. So you can get some of that like moody sky. Now if you wanted to do this without it being pink, again, I'd still lean purple, but it would probably be a little less mauve-y than this, really focusing on kind of some of that smokiness. But again, if I was going to do kind of something moody over here, it'd be a purpley variation of this sky, just to kind of keep it consistent where we still have some of that depth, we still have some of that interest, and I'm just kind of dabbing it on, where instead of having like a towel, which you could use, like what we did over here, you could do that and then add the purple. I think that like having this softness, just working quickly and getting wet on wet, helps a lot, and you still get kind of that story of the movement and things kind of slowly receding without losing some of that moodiness. If you have a way to make skies and clouds that I haven't reviewed here, I'd love to know in the comment section down below so that I can give it a try myself and learn more, because I'm still learning. I showed you some of my favorite ways to work with this, but I'm still testing things out and exploring, painting quite a bit, many of the paintings which will never see the light of day. So anyway, I hope that this video was helpful for you, that you learned a lot, not only like the anatomy of sky and clouds and that you have a better understanding of that, but also have a little bit more confidence in color mixing, a couple ideas for how to solve some of these problems, and just a game plan to get started on your own painting. All right, guys, I hope that you are having a wonderful, wonderful day. If you haven't subscribed already, do that down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy painting. All right, you ready? All right, I couldn't leave you without... Woo! Clean and crisp. I like it. I don't know if I got as lucky with this one. Oh, pretty good so far. Yes. Isn't that so much prettier than the yellow? That like yellowy, manila-y. Oh, I'm getting paper up. There we go. And once it touches, you back off. Oops. This will probably be the only time he's quiet.